On the Texas frontier, perhaps the only thing feared more than being killed outright by native tribes like the Comanche and the Apache was being taken alive. Many men, women, and children met grisly ends at the hands of these tribes, but many more were simply taken and never seen again. Tonight, History at the OK Corral examines 5 instances of those unfortunate souls who were kidnapped on the Texas frontier.
Austin, Texas, January 1861. Cynthia Ann Parker stares blankly at the new limestone buildings that line Congress Avenue and clutches her infant daughter closely. It has been more than a month now since her life has been turned upside down. When she had been taken from her home, her husband had been murdered and her 2 young sons had disappeared. This is the second time in the young woman's tragic life that such a fate has befallen her. As a young child, her family had been murdered, and she and her brother had been kidnapped. Now, she and her daughter, a sweet-natured baby girl named Prairie Flower, ride in a carriage making its way north toward the new Capitol building. They have been brought here by Cynthia Ann's uncle, a well-known Texan named Isaac Parker. An entrepreneur and politician, he and the entire Parker clan have searched for Cynthia Ann since she was taken decades ago from the family's frontier homestead. Isaac, a personal friend of Texas Governor Sam Houston, has brought Cynthia Ann and Prairie Flower here to beseech the Texas legislature to grant a stipend to the unfortunate young mother and daughter. The money is justifiable assistance, he insists, for a daughter of Texas who has suffered so greatly for so long. Silas walks Cynthia Ann and Prairie Flower into the Capitol building, where they are presented to the legislature, and Silas makes a heartened appeal that the state might have charity upon these unfortunate citizens. But Cynthia Ann does not speak English. She sees the impassioned speech of her uncle and the discerning eyes of those present in the Capitol, and surmises that the issue being debated is whether or not she and her daughter should be put to death. Terrified, she squeezes Prairie Flower tight to her chest and makes a desperate sprint for the looming doors of the Capitol. She is quickly, though gently, restrained and brought back to the chamber, where it is made clear to her what the actual nature of these proceedings involve. Eventually, Silas Parker's request will be granted. The Texas legislature approves a $100 a year payment for the term of 5 years to be paid to Cynthia Ann Parker. But for now, this all means nothing to Cynthia Ann. She is taken from the Capitol to a local photographer shop where a tintype is produced of her and Prairie Flower. In the tintype, an early form of photograph made by creating a direct positive on a sheet of thin metal known as a tin, Cynthia Ann sits tight-lipped and morose. She wears a striped skirt, a cotton blouse, and a wool robe with a clasp at the neck. Her daughter suckles at her exposed right breast, wrapped snugly in a dark blanket. The fatigue in her mother's eyes, after the distressing visit to the Capitol and suffering several hours of gawking by the 1860s Austinites, is palpable even more than a century and a half removed. It is the look of someone utterly miserable and utterly lost. Though she is indeed the stock of one of Texas's most notable families, Cynthia Ann does not know or care to know them. She does not consider herself, nor her daughter, to be a Texan nor an American, and she has no interest in adopting their culture or way of life. She does not, in fact, even assent to the name bestowed upon her by these blustery, industrious folk who seemed awash in their own foolery. Simply hearing the name Cynthia Ann causes her a visceral reaction of anger and revulsion. This is because, in her mind, she is the farthest thing from a Texan. She, for the last 30 years of her life, has existed as a member of the native tribe that all Texans feared more than any other, the Comanche. She has been known as Nautda, or someone found. She had lived a hard life, but a free life, on the ranges of the open prairie that most Americans, even most Texans, would only ever read about. She had been the wife of a chief, a strong, powerful man named Peta Nakona. She had been the mother of not only Prairie Flower, but 2 young boys who were the apples of her eye. The younger son, a boy named Peanuts, was kind and introspective. His older brother, however, was more serious, more assertive, and more circumspect. Only a few summers before, his mother had scolded and whipped him after the temerarious youngster had demanded that a visiting elder give him some of the buffalo meat that he had been allotted for his supper. The piece that he had been given, the 7-year-old boy coolly observed, was much smaller in comparison, and this was inherently unfair. His mother had beaten him and shoved the extra meat down his throat as punishment for disrespecting an elder guest. However, because of this headstrong nature, his mother had also always believed him destined for great things. His name was Quanah. But scarcely a month later, all that had come to a sudden, violent end. On December 19th of 1860, a detachment of Texas Rangers led by Captain Sol Ross crashed into their village, just outside the present-day town of, aptly enough, Quanah, Texas. Everything had happened in a flash, but to the best of her knowledge, Cynthia Ann's husband and 2 sons had been killed in the attack. The Rangers had taken Cynthia Ann alive and quickly surmised that she was, in fact, the legendary missing white girl who had been taken from Parker's Fort in 1836, when her own family had been killed by the Comanche. Now, here she sat, in Texas's capital city, having her photograph made. After the tintype and political pleadings are complete, the Parkers leave Austin and return to Silas's home in Birdville, Texas, northeast of Fort Worth. For the following several years, she and Prairie Flower will live with various members of the Parker family. However, Cynthia Ann remains miserable, completely unwilling and largely unable to adapt to her new lifestyle and surroundings. In 1864, the toddler Prairie Flower would succumb to influenza. Completely heartbroken and seemingly utterly alone, Cynthia Ann would continue to deteriorate, mounting a number of failed escapes. Each time, she would be brought back in a state of even greater misery and despair. In 1871, she began to refuse to eat and drink. There seemed to be nothing left in this life for her. In March of that year, she would finally pass away, it would seem, of a broken heart. As the bluebonnets began to bloom in 1871, poor Cynthia Ann Parker was laid to rest in Foster Cemetery near Pointer, Texas, outside of Fort Worth. She died believing her husband to be dead and her sons to be lost to the vast emptiness of the wilds. But Cynthia Ann was only partly right in these assumptions. Her husband, the war chief Peyton Nakona, had indeed, at least by most accounts, been killed in the fight with the Rangers. However, her 2 young sons, Quanah and Peanuts, had not. They had survived a harrowing ordeal, finding themselves alone and with no supplies in the middle of a vast expanse of frontier that had seen countless settlers perish under its merciless conditions. It was the middle of December, and the boys had to travel hundreds of miles without food or reliable water sources, all while being pursued by the Rangers. They would have to do all of this under the auspices of assuming both parents, as well as the rest of their friends and relatives, had just been killed. Though accounts of what would come to be known as the Battle of Peasy River vary, the Ranger attack on the village amounted to more of a massacre of mostly women and children and elderly Comanche than it did any actual pitched battle between comparable belligerents. H.B. Rogers, a ranger who participated in the fight, related the following reflection in his memoirs. "I was in the Peasy River fight, but I am not very proud of it. That was not a battle at all, but just a killing of squaws. 1 or 2 bucks and 16 squaws were killed. The Indians were getting ready to leave when we came upon them." A contingent of the Rangers pursued the 2 boys seen fleeing on the back of 1 horse, following them for 2 days and nights. Neither of the youngsters were of age to hunt or make war, but their upbringing as future Comanche warriors had prepared them well for this unfortunate scenario. They were indeed able to make it all the way to the nearest Comanche village, some 75 to 100 miles to the west. The camp was a very large collection of several villages that had coalesced for the winter in a canyon near the base of the Llano Estacado, Texas's vast expanse of staked plains. The 2 traumatized youngsters had rushed into the camp, causing a calamitous uproar when they reported the catastrophes of the last few days. All of their village had been killed, they said, and overrun by a force of 10,000 rangers. This was, of course, a wildly exaggerated claim driven by the boys' adrenaline. While many of the adult Comanche likely knew this, they also knew that if even a fraction of the boys' estimates proved to be true, their village could suffer the same fate. This band of Comanche, roughly 1,000 strong, broke camp as quickly as possible and made their way north, with Quanah and Peanuts in tow, where they wintered in the Wichita Mountains in present-day Oklahoma. For the next several years, the boys would carry on their lives with the Comanche on the high plains. However, their lives were now drastically different from the existence they had known previously. They had both grown up as the sons of a well-respected chief, and though they were known to be half-white because of their mother's adopted status in the tribe, they were still afforded a great measure of comfort and autonomy. However, as orphans, they found themselves often existing on the fringes of their culture. Quanah would later recount that, "We were often treated very cruelly, as orphans of only Indians are treated." Within a few years, Peanuts would be dead, though his cause of death is unknown. This left Quanah now bereft of family, legacy, and seemingly of hope. Again, quoting Quanah's personal recollection of the time, "It seemed then to me that I was left friendless. I had to beg for my food and clothes, and would scarcely get anyone to make or mend my clothes. I at last learned that I was treated more cruelly than the other orphans on account of my white blood." However, despite all of this, Quanah had burgeoned from a frightened and destitute youth to a powerfully built young warrior. Quanah's father, Peta Nakona, as well as his grandfather, the legendary Comanche war chief Iron Jacket, had been large, imposing men. So too had his mother's family, with the Parkers being known as sturdy Scotch-Irish stock. His great-grandfather, John Parker, who had been killed on the day Cynthia Ann had been taken by the Comanche, had fought in the Revolutionary War as a member of the Continental Army. Though orphaned and impoverished, Quanah, whose name has been translated to mean anything from fragrance to stink, was still the physical sum of his genetic components. And, by the age of 15, he had become a full-fledged warrior who stood almost a head taller than his cohorts and possessed a massive upper body musculature still evident in photos taken 50 years later. He possessed a powerful, discriminating intellect as well as a propensity for leading men in battle. Though circumspect and discerning in his day-to-day life, in battle he seemed to possess a reckless abandon in regard to his own safety. And, perhaps more than any of his fellow Comanche warriors, he possessed a deep, abiding hatred for whites. By the late 1860s, as his mother withers away under the care of relatives he has never met, Quanah Parker is on his way to becoming a war chief, and the Comanche are running rampant over the whole of Texas. And now, at the same time Cynthia Ann attempts to escape time and again and is literally dragged back into the homes of various Parker relatives, her beloved son sits around a campfire with other warriors, listening to 3 elder chiefs detail their plans for an upcoming raid. This camp, staked far out on the expanses of the Llano Estacado, is a coalescence of several Comanche bands. Quanah has grown up with the Nakone, but by the late 1860s is spending more and more time with the Quahati band. The chief of the band he is now with is a man named Bear's Ear. He now addresses the group of warriors, detailing his plan to raid deep into the territories of the East, stealing all of the horses that they can, and killing anyone who seeks to stop them. Comanche recruitment for warfare is still conducted as a relatively democratic affair, with war chiefs possessing only as much power as the raiding parties they are able to assemble are willing to grant them. This group of warriors, though, readily agrees to the plan. They have honed their skills in raiding, pillaging, and killing in the preceding few months, ravaging homesteads throughout central Texas. In a culture where one's social ascension is based on their martial prowess, these young men are all too eager to exact retribution on the intruders while simultaneously building their respective fortunes and reputation. They make ready and break camp the next day, heading due east over the rolling Texas plain. At perhaps the same moment, Cynthia Ann's well-meaning but frustrated relatives are scolding her yet again for cutting her hair short as part of the traditional Comanche grieving process, her eldest son is on his way to wreak havoc upon the Texan settlements north of Fort Worth. Comanche raiding has been so fierce and so prevalent in the preceding few years, the line of settlement has receded further back to the east than it was only a decade earlier. At this time in the late 1860s, it's estimated that there are less than 5,000 total members of the Comanche tribe still living free on the plains. However, what they lack in numbers, the Comanche make up for in brutality. The standard Comanche raid saw all fighting-age males killed, all of the women killed outright, sexually abused, or both, and all children not old enough to be self-sufficient summarily disposed of. These tactics had not only managed to forestall the advancement of American settlers for decades, they had, in fact, managed to drive them back. Thus, this raiding party must go further east than Quanah's father had to, only a decade before, in order to find the settlements that make up their quarry. They finally come upon several settlements near the present-day town of Gainesville, Texas, roughly 50 miles north of Fort Worth, and only 165 miles northwest of where Cynthia Ann Parker sits whiling away her tedious, lonely days. The raiding party manages to quickly accumulate a large herd of horses, so large that Bear's Ear decides they have enough to make their return trip. They push the large herd hard to the west, heading back to the relative security of the Llano Estacado. However, word has spread quickly to nearby Fort Richardson, near present-day Jacksboro, Texas, and a detachment of U.S. Army cavalrymen are already in pursuit of the raiding party. They finally catch up to the Comanche at the Red River, and a vicious fight ensues. Early in the battle, Bear's Ear is struck down by an Army bullet. As fire continues to rain down upon them, Quanah senses a collective despair amongst the Comanche ranks. The killing of a war chief is considered bad medicine and oftentimes seen as sufficient reason to abandon an engagement altogether. Quanah, however, seizes the opportunity and takes charge of directing his fellow warriors' actions. He yells at them to spread out and to turn the horses north to the river instead of continuing to move west. In the midst of a raging firefight, the Comanche managed to push a sizable horse herd into a 90-degree turn to the north and continue their egress onto the open plains. Quanah shouts exhortations and directives as the party crosses the river. However, he is closely pursued by a cavalry soldier who can tell that this young warrior is now the Comanche in charge and is thus now intent on killing him in hopes of ending the fight. The soldier gets close enough to fire at Quanah, but narrowly misses. Now enraged, the hulking young warrior quickly turns his horse and confronts the oncoming soldier head-on. He charges forward himself, with the two riders rapidly closing distance between each other and deliberately taking aim. The soldier fires again, grazing Quanah's thigh. A second later, Quanah looses his arrow, striking the soldier in the shoulder. Now disabled, the trooper drops his weapon and turns his mount, riding desperately back towards his own lines. Quanah, however, has no time to savor his micro-victory, as his charge has left him in an exposed position, making him a veritable sitting duck for Army sharpshooters. Quanah's Comanche warrior training kicks into high gear as he wheels his mount back towards his own lines. He urges the horse forward at full gallop as he deftly drops to the side of the animal, guarded from Army bullets. The charging steed plows into the Red River, with Quanah simultaneously diving in and crossing the river swimming side by side with his mount. Somehow, in a hailstorm of lead, both rider and horse remain unharmed and make it to the other side. The cavalrymen decide to proceed no further, as following the Comanche onto the open plains is tantamount to suicide. The raiding party makes its way north, and though slightly inconvenienced by the detour, they are more than impressed by the young Quanah's exploits that day. That night, Quanah is elected a war chief, and days later, the party makes their triumphant return. It is likely that Cynthia and, or at least the Parker family, have heard about the raiding going on north of Fort Worth, but they have no way of knowing that Quanah is among the raiders. Cynthia Ann would never know the fate of her young boys. Quanah would, however, learn what happened to his mother, and while he would never see her again, he always kept with him a copy of the tintype made that day in Austin. This, however, is just the beginning of the story of Quanah Parker. He would go on to become the last and greatest chief of the Comanche. The tales of his exploits and contributions to his people are legendary, as are the stories of his kinsmen who were killed in the massacre at Parker's Fort so many years before. The Parkers are among the most prominent families in Texas history, but their stories, as well as the stories of their descendant who became the great chief of the Comanche, are other stories for other times. West Texas, November 1855. As the cool autumn wind whips around them, a large party of Comanche men, women, and children make their way northeast through the barren country, on their way to the seasonal roaming territory of their most important source of sustenance, the huge herds of American bison, or buffalo, that roam the Great Plains. Though their austere surroundings would be enough to drive almost any mortal being to the brink of endurance, the Comanche seem wholly unbothered as they plod their way across the open prairie. One among their party, however, is visibly bedraggled by the incessant pace, an omnipresent cloud of dust stirred up by the Comanche horses and mules. He is a captive of the Comanche, taken as a human spoil of war in their ongoing conflict with the Texas Rangers and cattle ranchers who ventured out further onto the frontier with every passing year. His name is Nelson Lee. Only months prior, he had been a member of a group of enterprising horse traders who had been making the treacherous journey to Southern California to sell their vast herd of valuable horses and mules at a markedly higher price than they might garner in Texas, Louisiana, or east of the Mississippi. The party of 27 men had been set upon by the Comanche, and only Nelson Lee, William Akins, Thomas Martin, and Jonathan Stewart had managed to survive. Akins and Lee had been forced to watch as Martin and Stewart were subjected to vicious, hours-long torture killings at the hands of the Comanche. They had then been divided up amongst the war chiefs, and Lee had been designated as a slave to the renowned warrior Spotted Leopard. Lee will be relegated to the menial tasks of completing chores in camp, as well as the gory, stinking work of skinning and gutting the hulking buffalo that are harvested. His only hopes for survival are to comply with his captors in the Comanche, though the nearly unbearable pangs of loneliness and isolation incessantly tear at his psyche. Lee's experience is not entirely unique on the Texas frontier. For decades now, across the whole of central Texas, entire families have been killed or carried off, and entire farmsteads laid waste to by Comanche raiders intent on driving out any and all intruders from their hard-won lands. This policy is not necessarily driven as much by racial motives as it is by cultural ones, as the Comanche reserve the same treatment for any and all of their enemies, be they Anglo-Texans, Tejanos, Mexicans, Americans, Spanish, or members of rival tribes like the Tonkawa, Caddo, and Cheyenne. The Comanche have risen to prominence in this harsh land after migrating southward from the northern ranges of the Rocky Mountains after acquiring the horse in the 17th century. In the ensuing time period, they had swept through the southern plains and wrested virtually the whole of Texas from the control of perhaps their most hated enemy, the Apache. Though the vast majority of their encounters on the open expanses of the frontier have gone unrecorded in the annals of Western posterity, the results of the sheer brutality of this conflict were on clear display to the Spanish friars who inhabited the Catholic mission of San Saba, near today's town of the same name. Here, the resident priests saw what amounted to veritable hordes of Apache fleeing into the confines and comparative safety of the mission walls, in search of salvation from the incessant attacks of the Comanche. The Apache, too, have unleashed countless attacks on Comanche villages, killing men, women, and children, and taking any spoils and captives that they could. This cycle of violence is also not at all unique to the southern plains, but what is about to take place will be one of the few glimpses garnered by captive sources of the brutal realities of intertribal warfare. Unbeknownst to this Comanche band now traveling through these vast expanses, a group of Apache, also out on a hunting trip in hopes of fortifying their stock of meat for the winter ahead, is in the immediate vicinity. As the Comanche band, traveling in a group spread out over roughly a quarter of a mile, makes their way through a short expanse of hills and streams that dots the otherwise flat country, both parties are woefully unaware of the other's presence. The Comanche's extended traveling line is bookended by their group of pack mules in the back and a younger group of warriors to the front who dash back and forth playfully as the rest of the party plods away. Lee and Spotted Leopard ride near the rear, near the mules. Though he is still figuratively bound in the role of a captive slave, for the first time in many weeks, Lee is able to enjoy relatively unfettered movement as his limbs are left untied in order to enable him to work. He even has some measure of assurance that, as the Comanches have not yet killed him as they had his companions, he might even be able to someday become an adopted member of the tribe, an incredibly rare circumstance for any fighting-age male prisoner. For a brief moment, Lee is able to afford himself a psychological reprieve from his current plight. Then, suddenly, the warriors near the front of the procession become visibly animated, some of them dashing back towards Spotted Leopard, and some making their way to the crest of a hill to their immediate left. The cry goes up from the young warriors at the front of the line. The Apache have been spotted, and an attack is underway. Now, there is no time to waste. The lives of every single member of this party of Comanche, including not only their prisoners, but their women and children, are now in immediate danger. The word travels to every warrior that the Apache are approaching from the opposite side of the hill to their left, and the men all now scramble to form a battle line atop the hill in order to receive the oncoming Apache charge. In his autobiography entitled 3 Years Among the Comanche, a narrative of a Texas Ranger, Nelson Lee gives his first-hand account of the beginning of the battle. The whole band dashed upon the hill, except for Spotted Leopard and myself, who remained with the mules in the rear, and on reaching the summit, deployed into the line. By this time, I heard the cry of, "The Apaches! The Apaches!" and knew at once there was hot work at hand. As yet, however, I had seen nothing of an enemy, and only drew the inference that there was one present from the cries that I had heard, and the general commotion that prevailed. In the course of 2 or 3 minutes after our line was formed on the ridge, the air was rent with the noise of the war whoop, and up the opposite ascent, at full speed, came the Apaches in a solid body like a black cloud. As they approached, a shower of arrows were discharged from both lines. Then they rushed upon each other in a hand-to-hand encounter. A vicious fight now unfolds, as the Comanche warriors know that they are the only line of defense between the attacking Apache and their own women and children. Though firearms are certainly not uncommon amongst native frontier tribes by this time in the 1850s, they are not possessed by a great many warriors on either side in this case. Thus, the combat at hand entails up-close and personal encounters fought with spears, clubs, shields, hatchets, and knives. The bloody, violent conflict unfolds with shocking speed and intensity, with the only rules of engagement being victory by any means necessary. The cries of the vanquished and the exhortations of the victors resound about the battlefield, seeming to drown out any and all other sounds in the vicinity. Lee's personal account of the battle continues. From the position I occupied, I had a fair unobstructed view of the battle. It was fierce and terrible. The horses reared and plunged and fell upon each other, their riders dealing blow for blow, and thrust for thrust, some falling from their saddles to the ground, and others trampling madly over them. The Comanches outnumbered the enemy. Nevertheless, they were forced to retreat, falling back down the hill almost to my position. But still, they were not pursued, the Apaches appearing to be content to hold possession of the ground. Soon, the tribe of Spotted Leopard again rallied and dashed once more back into the attack. If possible, this contest was severer, as it was longer than the first. Again, the first blow was given and returned. Again, horses and men intermingled in melee, stumbled, fell, rolled upon the ground, while the wide heavens resounded with their hideous shrieks and cries. My blood thrilled through my veins as I looked upon the scene. I had mingled in encounters fierce even as that, but never before in the midst of the hottest fight was I overcome with such a sense of terror. To be an inactive spectator of a battle is far more painful than to be a participator in it. As the Apache warriors continue their onslaught, and the Comanche fight to defend their families, Lee struggles with the odd dichotomy of his situation as the lone captive observer. His account continues. I hoped devoutly during the engagement that the Comanches would be beaten, being impressed with the belief that if I should fall into the enemy's hands, my chances of escape would be increased. For I had often heard that the Apaches, though a most warlike nation, were more merciful to their prisoners than others of their race. But in this, I was disappointed. The Apaches at length gave way, disappearing beyond the ridge. Instead of pursuing their advantage, however, the Comanches hastily gathered up their dead and retreated towards the mountains we had crossed. As soon as they had left the ground, the Apaches again appeared upon the height and bore away their dead. It was a drawn battle. The Comanche have lost 17 of their own warriors in the fight, with Lee's account estimating that the Apache have likely lost approximately twice that number. The Comanche now commence with the unenviable task of burying their dead, as well as tending to their wounded. Amidst the carnage and sorrow, Lee recounts the Comanche approach to this grisly endeavor. The close of this eventful day was occupied in burying the slain, which ceremony was performed in their customary manner, except they seemed to chant the death song with more energy and feeling than on ordinary occasions. With them, death, at any time, even of the nearest and dearest of their kindred, is not regarded as an event to be deplored, but on the contrary, to be welcomed with rejoicing. But when a warrior dies on the field of battle, their joy and exultation knows no bounds, for their crude theology assures them that his departed spirit is, at once, caught up by the Great Spirit and borne to the region of everlasting and supreme felicity. After the dead are buried, the Comanches' lives, and their hunt for food, must continue. The band makes their way to their seasonal hunting grounds, seeing no more of the Apache along the way. Here, they will remain for 2 months, harvesting buffalo and camping on the open plains. By the next spring, a peace with the Apache will be struck. With the ever-increasing encroachment of American and Mexican settlers into their territories, the two tribes come to view a partnership affording each some form of mutual protection as a far better option to the continued intertribal slaughter. For his part, Lee will eventually escape and go on to continue his adventurous life on the Texas frontier for years to come, ultimately succumbing to an undisclosed illness in New York City on December 21, 1871. But the many tales of brutal intertribal warfare and unyielding violence between settlers and the native tribes of the American frontier, as well as the countless tales of conflict and combat from Nelson Lee's personal account of his life and times in Texas are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Mason County, Texas, 1925. Even in the stifling August heat, the local rodeo grounds were packed with people. They had certainly come to see the rodeo, but more than anything, they had come to see the feature show that would kick off the festivities. In a small pen, a yearling calf stood grazing. A few dozen yards away, a local man stood conversing with a few men he knew from his hometown. His demeanor was jovial as he traded jokes and fed off the anticipatory energy of the event to come. At first glance, he seemed no different than his rural Central Texas counterparts, except that he wore buckskin leggings and a fringed buckskin shirt. But he moved just slightly differently, spoke just slightly differently. He finally bade his comrades farewell and hopped on his horse from the right-hand side, a habit that was seen as very peculiar by the American riders around him. His horse had no saddle and no bridle, led only by a single looped rein tied to a simple halter looped around the horse's head. Now, on horseback, he seemed transformed, like another being. Suddenly, he seemed dangerous. He then pulled on a headdress, full of feathers, ribbons, and beads. Now the crowd became hushed, partly out of reverence and partly out of fear. For the mild-mannered, gray-haired local man was not just another resident. His story was known far and wide. He had lived a life few could only dream of, seen and done things most would hope to never endure. And now, here he was. No longer a peaceable old gentleman who loved babies and telling jokes. The playful, mischievous glint in his eyes had shifted starkly, seemingly instantaneously. His eyes now seemed small, cold, and coal black. Where moments before had been a warm and welcoming smile, was now barely concealed a snarling of his upper lip. Suddenly, every move was sharp and crisp, every action laser-focused, and done seemingly subconsciously. He had told of how, as a younger man, he had killed many a wolf and drank its blood as a means of acquiring the wolf's traits and powers. Now, to many of those present who had heard this story, they began to wonder if it might actually be true. The way he rode, the way he presented and handled his short, stout bow, radiated an energy and presence that most in the crowd had only heard of in theory. Now, they were about to see it in practice. The calf, weighing about 300 pounds, was released into the arena and ran about seemingly as confused as were many of the first-time spectators. It could be safely assumed that even in this crowd from rural central Texas in the 1920s, somebody there felt at least a little bad for this animal. But that somebody was not Herman Lehman. He gave a loud, piercing war whoop, rode his pony into the dusty arena at full clip, chased the animal down, and loosed an arrow into its heart from behind, all while controlling his horse with subtle cues from his feet and knees. As soon as the bovine fell, dead within seconds due to blood loss from the expertly placed shot, Herman Lehman had dismounted in one swift motion, drawn his knife, and cut the calf's throat to bleed it out. Then, again seemingly in one deft motion, he split open the abdominal cavity, yanked out the liver, pulled out the gallbladder, squirted its bile onto the liver, and ate it raw in large, ravenous chomps. To some present, this was as close to the Old West as they would ever get. To Herman, this was ultimately a sad and sorry substitute for the life he had once known and loved, for Herman Lehman had not learned his martial skills practicing on cattle alone. He had scalped, pillaged, burned, and killed real human beings all throughout Texas and northern Mexico. He had fought the Texas Rangers, terrorized Mexican ranchers, and brutalized opposing tribes. He had been a proud Comanche warrior, wild, free, and bellicose, riding free on the staked plains of Texas. He had been the adopted son of Chief Quanah Parker and a respected member of his tribe. He had been born not far from Mason, Texas in 1859 to Ernst and Augusta Lehman. His father had died when he was very young, and his mother had remarried to Philip Bookmeyer in 1863. He was the third of 8 children, though on May 16, 1870, it was just 11-year-old Herman and his 8-year-old brother Willie who had gone out to watch the sheep and shoo off crows from their stepfather's burgeoning cornfield. As days on the farm in central Texas went, the boys assumed this would be a relatively easy day in comparison to the summer harvest to come. They were only a few hundred yards from their family's cabin when the small party of Apache made their move. They thundered over a small ridgeline and fell upon the young boys like eagles swooping down to harvest a salmon from a placid lake. Herman fought as hard as he could, but the chief present, a man named Colonel Viste, knocked him over the head with a pistol and lashed him to a horse. Within a matter of seconds, Willie and Herman Lehman were gone. Their mother and stepfather were not only horrified, but completely caught off guard and unsure where to even begin their search. All they knew was that the party had taken off to the northwest. Soon, they would hit the endless expanses of the North Texas prairie, and then they would likely be gone forever. The Lehmans implored every available military and law enforcement official in Mason and then San Antonio to help, but they informed them that they could do little as resources were scarce and the territory to be covered was vast. It would be a group of the legendary Buffalo Soldiers, comprised largely of recently freed former slaves from the South, who would pursue and engage the raiding party in a brief but incredibly intense firefight that would see the sergeant in command, Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz, become the first black enlisted man to receive the Medal of Honor. In fleeing this skirmish, Willie would fall off the back of his captor's horse, and find himself stranded alone on the Texas frontier. He would, however, by sheer grit and determination and some luck, find his way back home. When he was brought to his mother, the traumatized young boy was asked if he knew where his brother might have been taken. He replied simply, eerily, that Herman has gone on, Mama. They took him on. Willie had no idea how right he really was. Herman was taken far out on the plains, physically abused and made to work nonstop as a slave to the tribe. On the nonstop day and night ride towards the plains, Herman became horribly sunburnt and suffered from being severely dehydrated and delirious from lack of food. On the third night, they came upon a fat calf while crossing the field. Carnoviste killed it, cut it open just as Herman would so many years later at his demonstration, and forced Herman's head into the gaping paunch of the still steaming dead animal. He forced Herman to slurp up the curdled milk from the calf's stomach. Herman vomited this up. Carnoviste forced him to eat what he had thrown up. Herman threw up again. Carnoviste beat the boy until he was bruised and bloodied. Then he was given a small piece of raw liver. This he kept down. The party carried on. After a few months, Carnoviste would lead another raiding party to Mason. In fact, they would head right back to the Lehman household, where Herman's mother and sisters were tending to the farm as Philip Buchmeyer and Willie were out irrigating the fields. They attempted to, again, steal all they could and terrorize the family. But this time, Augusta Buchmeyer would let loose 2 loads of buckshot into both Carnoviste and another brave who were attempting to climb through the window. The raiding party fled, back over the miles of hills and prairies. When they arrived back to camp, an enraged Carnoviste, still with a backside full of lead shot, beat Herman to within an inch of his life. He then informed the young boy that his entire family had been murdered. This was not true and meant only to add insult to injury, as both Carnoviste's flesh and ego had been so violently assaulted by Herman's mother. Herman fell into a suicidal despair for days, unsure how to escape and unsure how to even find the means to end his own life. Then, something in Herman Lehman's mind flipped. Today, it might be diagnosed as Stockholm Syndrome, a coin termed after a terrorist incident in 1970 Sweden in which the hostage taken eventually began to identify more with her captors than her rescuers. But in the 1870s, out on the burning plains, young Herman Lehman knew of no such diagnostic term. Nor would he have had any interest, for Herman had now made up his mind as to what he was going to do. There would be no more plans of fleeing home. He was home now. Herman made up his mind then and there to become an Apache warrior. He said if they wanted to kill white people, if they wanted to run roughshod over the Texans and Mexicans and steal horses and burn farmsteads, then he would do all of that as best he could. Perhaps this was a place to put his rage and grief. Perhaps it was a purely pragmatic survival measure. Or perhaps it was both. But no matter the motivation, Herman Lehman would go on to be an unholy terror to anyone and anything he perceived as an enemy for the better part of the next decade. His exploits appear nearly endless. He would go on to be adopted into the tribe, to subsequently kill a medicine man in retribution for the murder of his adopted father, Carnoviste. He would flee to the feared and fearless Comanche, and would ultimately be one of the last members of the tribe to surrender to the U.S. government. The many tales of Herman Lehman and the lives of a plethora of other captured frontier children all merit countless episodes of their own. And to be sure, those episodes are coming soon. But for now, those are other stories for other times.
Central Texas, winter, 1839. Texas Ranger Andrew Lockhart stands ensconced in a deadly fight, with bullets and arrows flying all around. Lockhart is part of an assaulting force of Rangers and Lehman Apache,
who had ventured here to the San Gabriel River, roughly 100 miles north of Austin, with the intent of pursuing and engaging a party of Comanche who have been raiding in the area in the previous few weeks. Now, with the Comanche being completely unaware of their presence and mostly just rising from a night's sleep, the Rangers have caught them off guard. All throughout the village, women and children scatter. Warriors attack and are shot down and clubbed, and war cries and death howls abound. However, Andrew Lockhart barely notices either the cacophony nor the danger about him, as he fires upon any warrior he can find, and screams, unconsciously and incessantly, for his daughter. "Matilda! Matilda! If you are here, run to me!" Again and again the desperate father screams, seemingly unconcerned with the actions of his cohorts or their commander. It has been nearly a year since he has seen the teenage girl, one in which he has slept little and thought of virtually nothing else but her welfare and rescue. Andrew Lockhart had moved to Texas from Illinois in 1828, settling in the DeWitt colony on the Guadalupe River. Here, he and his wife had raised their children, the eldest among whom being Matilda, who records hold as being somewhere between 14 and 16 years of age. The previous fall, Matilda and 4 children from the neighboring Putnam family, Rhoda Putnam, aged 14, James Putnam, aged 7, Elizabeth Putnam, aged 5, and Lucy Putnam, aged 2, had ventured out amongst the nearby pecan groves on the banks of the Guadalupe River to engage in the time-honored tradition of gathering pecans. While the group was concentrated on their task at hand, they fell victim to a band of Comanche raiders who had hidden themselves in the brush nearby. While the 3 youngest Putnam children, James, Elizabeth, and Lucy, were fallen upon and swept up by the Comanche within moments, Matilda had first attempted to make a break for their home, in hopes of alerting her father to what had happened. The cries of her friend Rhoda Putnam, however, caused her to lose heart in this pursuit and return to try and assist her friend in escaping. This fateful decision resulted in both of them being captured, and within minutes, all 5 of the terrified and crying children were strapped to the back of Comanche ponies. The party of Comanche and captives then made their way due west at top speed, traveling long and hard on the ever more sparse and unforgiving landscape. As they traveled, rescue efforts were already being organized, though to little effect. When the Putnams and Lockharts met later that day, both families in virtual hysterics over the state of their missing children, they found there to be frustratingly few options for retribution at their disposal. Though they certainly desired to pursue the Comanche immediately, doing so would leave the family members left behind in danger of a second attack. They would need assistance. This assistance would come in the form of Captain John Tumlinson, who arrived with his small surveying party of 6 men. Tumlinson and his men had been surveying the area west of San Antonio when they had narrowly missed being overrun themselves by the Comanche raiding party that had taken Matilda Lockhart and the Putnam children. When they arrived on the west banks of the Guadalupe River, they found all of the homesteads on that side. News of the abductions had spread like wildfire, causing those on the western side of the river to cross to the eastern side and congregate at the homestead of another DeWitt colony settler, William Taylor. Several of the men of DeWitt's colony and Tumlinson's survey party immediately organized a rescue party, crossing the river again and taking to the trail of the Comanche as quickly as it could be discerned. Though the men put forth their utmost efforts in pursuing the Comanche and the stolen children, it was soon apparent that these efforts were in vain. The children were gone, lost into the vast expanses of the Texas frontier, and it was very likely that they would never be seen again. It was well known amongst all of the settlers what kind of treatment would be in store for the captives, and now all the grieving family could do was wait, hope, and pray for their safe return. The children, meanwhile, were now tasked with surviving amongst a wholly new and harshly unforgiving reality. Comanche treatment of captives varied wildly with consideration to age and gender. Most captured infants were summarily and cruelly dispatched by the Comanche, who saw the care required for a child of that age as too much of a hindrance while on the rapid egress after their capture. Older children, however, after an initial period of ingratiation, were often adopted into the tribe. With notoriously low birth rates due to their nomadic, horse-bound lifestyle and an existence built entirely around hunting and warfare, the Comanche were often all too willing to adopt captives from other tribes, as well as Spanish, Anglo, and Mexican captives. Adult women would find themselves relegated to miserable existences as slaves, sexual and otherwise, to their captors. Men would generally be tortured to death, via any number of unthinkable methods, such as stretching a victim out on the ground and heaping hot coals upon them, or slowly filleting them alive. In the case of Matilda Lockhart and the 4 Putnam children, their treatment would largely follow this protocol. The 3 youngest Putnam children, James, Elizabeth, and Lucy, were quickly adopted into the tribe, where they would live for many years. Rhoda Putnam and Matilda Lockhart, however, were afforded no such kind treatment. Though no record exists of their chastity being violated, physical abuse of other kinds abounded for both unfortunate young women. They were routinely made to travel from 50 to 75 miles a day on horseback over rough territory, forced to do the dirtiest jobs in camp, such as tanning hides and carrying water, and routinely tortured via beatings and burnings. While his daughter endured the hardships of life as a prisoner amongst the Comanche, Andrew Lockhart was left with the unenviable task of caring for his wife and remaining 8 children while attempting to keep abreast of any search parties being formed, or recent news of his daughter's whereabouts. It would be an entire year before word of a local party of Texas Rangers and Lehman Apache scouts arrived at the Lockhart homestead, and Andrew Lockhart hurried out to join them. The Rangers were in pursuit of another raiding party of Comanche, who had again spent the preceding months incessantly raiding and killing the Texan homesteaders. Captain William Mosby Eastland had mustered 30 men from the nearby town of LaGrange, while another force of 30 men had been assembled in Bastrop, with this force being led by Ranger Noah Smithwick. The Rangers and their Lehman Apache scouts, longtime enemies of the Comanche, all rode under the overall command of Colonel John H. Moore, a veteran of the Texas Revolution and prominent leader in the Battle of Gonzales. Indignant at the personal and collective toll the Comanche raiding parties have exacted upon them over the previous weeks, months, and years, the heavily armed party then made its way north to the San Gabriel River. Though the weather was cold and sleeting, and conditions seemed only to worsen with every passing hour, the party remained resolute in pursuing their quarry. The Lehman Apache scouts, exemplifying extraordinary endurance and courage, ventured miles out ahead of the main body in order to reconnoiter the surrounding area. They initially reported the camp as being further south on the San Gabriel River. However, upon reaching the location, the Rangers and scouts found the Comanche had moved their camp. The following is an excerpt from Noah Smithwick's personal accounts of the events, taken from his memoirs entitled The Evolution of a State. When we reached the point at which the Lehmans reported the camp, the Comanches had moved, leaving a trail leading upstream. We followed on up on the head of the San Gabriel, where we were now taken by a storm of snow and sleet, which was so severe we were obliged to take shelter. We made for a grove of post oaks on the divide between the San Gabriel and the Colorado, in the shelter of which we struck camp. The storm continued with increasing cold. Some of the horses froze to death, and the Indians, loath to see so much good meat go to waste, ate the flesh. During their tedious and blustery day, a rifle which had been leaned up upon one of the post oak trees fell to the ground and discharged. One of Captain Eastland's Rangers, a young man whose name has been lost to posterity, was tragically struck in the torso by the errant shot and gravely wounded. Finally, after 3 days of enduring freezing temperatures, snow, and the rapidly declining health of their comrade, the conditions cleared sufficiently for the men in the camp to move out. Smithwick's account continues. Our men had constructed a rawhide boat and started our wounded man down the Colorado in charge of 2 comrades. The poor young fellow, whose name I do not now remember, died on the way down and was buried in the sand. We saddled up and started for the Comanche camp, going up within a few miles of the place when we halted and lay on our firearm, while Malcolm Hornsby, Joe Martin, and 2 Lehman went forward after dark to locate the exact position of the camp. On their return, they reported a much larger camp than the Lehmans previously reported. Disconcerted by the unexpected intelligence, Colonel Moore rather demurred to attack, but we had come out to hunt a fight and were willing to take the responsibility. One big, rough fellow said he did not care if there were 1,000 of them if there were horses enough to justify the fight. When within a mile of the camp, we dismounted and tied our horses. We then crept up upon the sleeping Indians, who were not dreaming of an attack. As soon as daylight gave us the exact situation of the camp, we made a rush for it, pouring a volley right into the lodges. Taken completely by surprise, the savages bounded from their lodges and scattered like partridges. Our men rushed right in among the lodges, the women and children screaming, dogs barking, men yelling and shooting, in a moment transformed the peaceful scene on which the day had just but dawned into a pandemonium. In this pandemonium, Andrew Lockhart now rushes about the village, desperately crying out for his lost daughter. As the seconds tick by, his anxiety and despair rise higher and higher, rendering everything around him nearly inaudible and indiscernible. Suddenly, for reasons inexplicable to everyone but the commander himself, Colonel Moore orders a retreat, commanding the men to move back to the cover of a timbered thicket near the village. Lockhart and the rest of the Rangers, confused and indignant, nonetheless withdraw to the thicket, losing both their advantage in position and surprise. Many of the Lehman Apache present are disgusted by this order and decide to leave the battlefield. However, while on their egress, they manage to stampede a significant portion of the Comanche horse herd, rendering most of their warriors footbound. The Comanche, still reeling but incensed, now marshal their forces in a line of warriors and advance upon the thicket. As this contingent advances upon the Rangers, another group of Comanche make their way around the backside of the thicket and scatter every one of the Rangers' horses. As this happens, a charge is made by the Comanche to the front of the thicket, and a volley of fire pours out of the Ranger positions, killing several of the warriors and rendering one unfortunate Comanche paralyzed on the field of battle between the two parties. The wounded Comanche, in a startling display of warrior spirit, fires arrows in high arcs into the thicket, all while laying on his back. This grisly scene was soon concluded when one of the Lehman Apache warriors, a famed chief by the name of Flacco, rushed forward to dispatch the Comanche with a lance. After this, the Comanche attack momentarily abates, as both sides withdraw to their respective positions. Finally, a Lehman Apache woman, a prisoner of the Comanche, walks out of the village, towards the thicket, waving a white flag of truce. One of the Lehman Apache scouts ventures forward and briefly converses with her. She tells him the Comanche have lost many of their best warriors and inquires as to the losses of the Rangers and Lehman Apache. The Lehman Apache keenly informs her, in a cunning lie, that his party has not received so much as a flesh wound. This, however, is not true. Felix Taylor, a longtime Ranger, has been shot in the knee, and Joe Martin, who Noah Smithwick notes as one of our best men, has received a shot to the back, rendering him paralyzed from the waist down and in excruciating pain. He begs his comrades to dispatch him in the name of decency and mercy, but none abide his wishes. Martin then insists that he be given a pistol so that he may end his own suffering, but is told only to, quote, bear up bravely, and that he would be returned home. Now, the Rangers find themselves in an incredibly precarious situation. They are at least 100 miles away from the closest town in Austin, Texas, completely on foot, and with 2 wounded and immobile comrades in tow. Now, they must make their way back south, under the constant threat of Comanche reprisal. This reprisal, however, does not come. Though the party will indeed return safely to Austin, the specter of the tragedies related to the fight that day will loom large for weeks and months to come. Joseph Martin will make it home, only to perish a scant few weeks later from his horrific wound. And while Martin's agonizing demise is certainly the stuff of nightmares, it is Andrew Lockhart whose grief will only intensify. Noah Smithwick's account of Lockhart at the fight is all too humanizing in its tragic circumstances. I never felt sorrier for a man than I did for Colonel Lockhart, whose young daughter had been taken captive by the Comanches, and who we had every reason to believe was in that camp. His feeling that he was indeed so close to his beloved daughter would be proven tragically correct when, a little over a year later, Matilda Lockhart would finally be returned to her family in an exchange with the Comanche organized in San Antonio in the spring of 1840. Even this long-awaited reunion, however, would be marred by the cruelty and dehumanization that is inherently linked to human conflict throughout history. One account of her appearance that day, given by noted Texas luminary Mary Maverick, paints a visceral image of the severity and totality of the abuse wrought upon Matilda Lockhart during her captivity. She was in a frightful condition, poor girl. Her head, arms, and face were full of bruises and sores, and her nose actually burnt off to the bone, all the fleshy end gone, and a great scab formed at the end of the bone. Both nostrils were wide open and denuded of flesh. She told a piteous tale of how dreadfully the Indians had beaten her, and how they would wake her from sleep by sticking a chunk of fire to her flesh, especially to her nose. Ah, it was sickening to behold, and made one's blood boil for vengeance. All of the Putnam children would eventually be returned, largely against their will. Even Rhoda, the teenage girl who was roughly the same age as Matilda, would go on to marry a chief and was loath to return to Anglo society. Matilda's return, however, would spark one of the most violent, calamitous instances in the history of the Old West, in what would come to be known as the Council House Fight, a veritable bloodbath in which Comanche were hunted down in the streets of San Antonio. In response to this, the settlements surrounding San Antonio and Austin were besieged for weeks by some of the most horrific attacks the Texans had seen yet. In the scope of Texas history, these events would mark only the early stages of what would become a decades-long war for the Lone Star State. We here at HOKC have covered some of these events before, and you can find links to our videos on the Council House Fight as well as the Battle of Plum Creek in the description below. But the countless other tales of terror, tragedy, cunning, and courage are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Bastrop, Texas, February 24th, 1839. In the late winter chill of a placid evening, the citizens of this small village east of Austin find themselves largely engaged with chores and preparations for evening meals. While Texas is an independent republic, having established its independence from Mexico in the Texas Revolution of 1836, it is still a slave-holding territory. Several of the wealthier citizens of Bastrop are slave owners, and thus many of the local inhabitants are slaves, subject to the dehumanizing effects of chattel servitude, even here on the bleeding edges of Western civilization's westernmost expansion. Adding to the cultural milieu that is commonplace here in 1830s Texas are several Quiche natives, as well as Tejano citizens, native Texans of Hispanic descent. Though all are subject to the stratified racial and economic hierarchy of early 19th century America, here on the Texas frontier, they live under the auspices of a singular fear that is shared by all. That of the incessant, horrifically violent raiding being carried out all across the Texas frontier by the dreaded lords of the Southern Plains, the Comanche. Time and time again in the preceding decade, Texas settlers found themselves subject to acts of violence and degradation that had scarcely, if ever, been seen by their predecessors east of the Mississippi. Countless homesteads across the Texas frontier had been laid waste to, with entire families killed or carried off into slavery. Torture killings were common, as were all manner of assaults, including sexual and otherwise. The attacks did not discriminate by race, gender, social class, religious affiliation, nationality, nor age. The Apache, the Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Spanish, and the Mexicans who have inhabited Texas since the early 18th century have all fallen victim to the Comanche. The inhabitants of central Texas in 1839 are but the latest iteration of a people living on the fringes of what had come to be known to the Spanish as Comancheria. The threat of raiding is in fact so pervasive that the town of Bastrop has its own warning system, instituted by Texas Ranger, Texas Revolution veteran, and Texas Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Edward Burleson. In the event of a Comanche raiding party being sighted, citizens are instructed to sound off with a long retort from a bugle-like brass horn, followed by 2 gunshots in rapid succession. Upon hearing this, the neighboring homestead is to repeat the signal until it reaches the vicinity of the town of Bastrop itself. Here, a small cannon will be fired, serving as the call for the local men to muster and prepare for a Comanche attack. However, as the hue of dusk begins to settle over the city of Bastrop and its surrounding farms and plantations, the threat of Comanche violence seems a world away. Then, suddenly, just as most of the town's inhabitants are getting ready to settle in for their evening meal, the high-pitched, monotone intonations of a bugle can be heard in the distance, followed quickly by 2 gunshots. Less than a minute later, even nearer to the center of town, the same piercing retort of a bugle, followed by 2 gunshots, can be heard. Moments later, the cacophonous rumble of a small cannon can be heard roaring from the center of town. The Comanche, it seems, have struck again. As the fighting-age men assemble in the town square, word quickly circulates as to the cause of the alarm. A local family, the Colemans, have been attacked. Though not necessarily unique on the Texas frontier, the story that now spreads like wildfire through the town of Bastrop is sickeningly violent, and demonstrative of the extremely violent, often macabre nature of Comanche raids in Texas. A combined force of Caddo, Waco, and Comanche raiders had struck the homestead of Elizabeth Coleman, a recently widowed mother, and her 5 children. Her eldest son James had been out in the Coleman's fields with a family friend named James Rogers, plowing rows for spring crops. They had been the first to be set upon by the Comanche, who cut them off from retreat to the family cabin. The two young men had made their escape through a thickly forested area, but would be too late in securing help for their loved ones. Minutes after abandoning the chase for Rogers and James Coleman, the large force of native warriors fell upon Elizabeth Coleman and her 4 younger children. Elizabeth and the children had been in front of the Coleman's family cabin, working in the garden situated roughly 50 yards from the door. Suddenly, the young mother and her children saw the blood-curdling sight of several hundred native warriors charging towards them at full speed. Elizabeth Coleman had screamed for the children to flee to the cabin, and all but the youngest, 5-year-old Thomas Coleman, had been able to make it. Thomas Coleman, however, was swooped up violently by a warrior on horseback. Seeing this, Elizabeth Coleman had turned course and attempted to help her youngest son. Within seconds of instinctually whirling about in order to pursue her captured child, she had been struck in the throat by an arrow. She had fled back to the cabin, making it through the door and helping her 12-year-old son, Albert Coleman, bar the door to prevent the attacking warriors, now dismounted and assaulting the front door, from gaining entry. Elizabeth had then collapsed, mortally wounded, as Albert Coleman gathered the 3 guns kept at the cabin. Amidst the shrieks of his siblings and the dire condition of his mother, 12-year-old Albert had put up a truly unbelievable fight against the Comanche and their native allies. He fired upon any warrior who managed to breach the door, killing one outright and wounding another. He then raised one of the cabin's floorboards and instructed his younger siblings to hide underneath them and to not make a sound until they heard voices speaking in English. The preteen boy then continued reloading and firing his weapons, pouring out such voluminous fire that the attacking warriors assumed there to be several grown men defending the cabin. Finally, however, young Albert was fatally wounded by a shot from one of the attacking warriors. With his last breaths, he reiterated his instructions to his siblings hidden beneath the floorboards before finally collapsing near the body of his mother. The attacking party of Comanche and their allies had then taken the young Thomas Coleman and carried their attack on to the neighboring farmstead of one Dr. Joseph Robertson. Robertson and his family were not home. However, there were several unfortunate slaves who, without access to firearms, were unable to proffer any kind of defense. 7 of them were summarily taken away by the attacking native forces, destined for lives as slaves amongst the Comanche and their allies. It would be late in the afternoon, several hours after the attack, that a young neighbor of the Colemans named John D. Anderson found the farmstead to be curiously silent and devoid of activity. He had been the first to discover the grizzly scene at the Coleman cabin, and had managed to rescue the 2 youngest children hidden under the floorboards. From here, realizing the danger all 3 of them were now in, Anderson had set the youngsters astride his horse and made a mad dash to Wells Fort, roughly 12 miles to the west. From here, the children were placed under a guard and runners were sent out to the surrounding towns. These runners alerted the first homestead they had arrived at, initiating the chain of warning shots that now cuts through the air in Bastrop. The men from Bastrop and other surrounding counties coalesced their forces at Wells Fort. While gathered at the fort, Jacob Burleson, brother of the famed Colonel Edward Burleson, is elected to take command. Jacob Burleson and his company of rangers and ad hoc volunteers begin searching the area for the Comanche war party they know to be close by. The search continues into the night, and into the next morning, when finally, at about 10 a.m., the large raiding party is spotted near what is known as Post Oak Island, located roughly 4 miles north of Brushy Creek. Though much of the popular lore surrounding such encounters on the Texas frontier is centered on the actual combat, the biggest problem encountered by the Texans combating the Comanche and other native tribes was actually finding their adversary on the vast expanses of this seemingly endless landscape. With this foremost task now accomplished, the Texians pursue their quarry at full gallop. And a classic Comanche tactic, still relatively unknown to their Anglo adversaries in the 1830s, the Comanche now feign a full-scale retreat. The Comanche and their allies make a mad dash for a thickly wooded thicket, while the Texians, starting roughly from a half a mile behind, pursue them in a zigzag course, aiming to cut off any additional path of retreat. As the Texians proceed to within rifle range of the Comanche, they dismount and form a battle line. While this practice was common in the eastern woodlands, here on the open expanses of Texas, it is perhaps the biggest tactical blunder that can be made. As soon as the Rangers' and Volunteers' boots are on the ground, the Comanche and their allies immediately turn their ponies and make a headlong attack at the now footbound Texians. This catches the Texians off guard and sends the line of men scattering towards their own horses. One of the young Rangers, a man by the name of W.S. Wallace, sees his horse panic and race off towards the Comanche lines, instantly becoming a trophy for the native forces. Now on foot and helpless, Wallace makes a sprint in the direction of his comrades in a desperate bid to escape. Seeing the dire straits of his compatriot, Captain Jack Haney turns his mount around, races back towards Wallace, and sweeps him onto his horse. The two narrowly escape a hail of Comanche arrows, which would have all but certainly resulted in grievous injury or death. Further down the Texian line, Captain Jacob Burleson, along with Franklin Highsmith and the teenaged Winslow Turner, arrive at their horses just in time to potentially evade the oncoming Comanche charge. However, in their panicked frenzy, the young Turner forgets to untie his horse, which is picketed to the ground. Seeing this, Captain Jacob Burleson turns, rushes back towards the youngster, dismounts, and unties the horse. Turner dashes off, but Jacob Burleson, just upon reaching his own horse, is struck by a gunshot in the back of his head. In the chaos of the retreat, his body is left where it falls. The Rangers and Volunteers now retreat roughly 3 miles back towards Wells Fort before stopping momentarily to rest their horses. As the horses rest, the Rangers and Volunteers descend into a malaise of anger, self-doubt, confusion, and contention. It is well known among them all that, at this very moment, the body of their countryman and comrade, Jacob Burleson, is being subject to all manner of posthumous mutilations by the Comanche. In both an effort to add literal insult to injury, as well as to hamper the person in the next life, many tribes customarily practice disfiguring the bodies of their slain enemies. The accounts of those Texas settlers who had found the bodies of their friends and family had circulated amongst every community on the frontier for many years, even at this point in the 1830s. The prevailing opinion amongst the Rangers and Volunteers alike is that the Comanche must be re-engaged. But the matter of exactly how to go about this presents a conundrum for the bellicose and indignant men. In the midst of contentious discussions on how to further proceed, at around noon, another force of 30 Rangers and Volunteers, riding under the command of Captain Jacob Burleson's brother, Colonel Edward Burleson, arrives. Informed of the death of his brother, Colonel Burleson marshals the combined forces, roughly 84 men in total, and the party makes their way back towards Brushy Creek. They ride past the brushy thicket, as well as the mutilated body of Jacob Burleson. Finding the thicket now empty, the Texians scan the surrounding countryside. They are met with yet another troubling, formidable sight. On the top of a large plateau near Brushy Creek, the Comanche and their allies have marshaled their forces into a large horseshoe formation, ready and waiting to receive the Rangers' forthcoming charge. Colonel Edward Burleson decides that he will divide his forces. He orders one of his officers, Captain Billingsley, to lead half of the men to attack the Comanche and their allies from below the plateau, while another contingent, led by Captain Rogers, will advance up a small ravine on the backside of the plateau. However, upon arriving at their tactical destinations, both officers find themselves roughly 50 yards from the entrenched Comanche position, with nothing but a coverless no-man's land in between the two parties. Now, an entrenched, prolonged battle drags out, with each side taking shots from their positions. One Comanche warrior in particular manages to kill 2 Texians and wound several others, acting as a masterful sniper with his single-shot rifle. Finally, young Winslow Turner locates the warrior's position from the gun smoke rising off of his weapon. Turner manages to climb a small tree, gain an advantage in position, and dispatch the sharpshooting Comanche with a carefully placed shot of his own. Finally, as the sun sets and night falls over the landscape, the Comanche and their allies retreat under cover of the night. As their enemies retreat, the Rangers and Volunteers are met with the haunting, visceral cries of the Comanche themselves, mourning the loss of their own beloved friends and family who have fallen that day. In the aftermath of the fight, the brutal, inhumane nature of warfare on the Texas frontier is left all too apparent to the survivors present. The Rangers and volunteers now advance to the Comanche position, finding a singular survivor, one of the unnamed captured slaves taken by the Comanche the day prior. The man lies near death, with 9 arrows protruding from his body in various places. He has clearly been left for dead. But the man not only miraculously survives, he is able to give testimony to Colonel Burleson that the Comanche had carried off roughly 30 of their own dead. The Rangers and volunteers have, for their part, suffered 3 fatalities, including Jacob Burleson. One additional casualty, the Reverend James Gilleland, would die a little over a week later from the gunshot wound he incurred to his neck. In this world of cruelty, hardship, shifting alliances, and seemingly constant violence, the Battle of Brushy Creek provides a notable example of the multifaceted, cross-cultural, and cross-social nature of life on the Texas frontier in the 1830s. Even in the all-too-often macabre history of humanity, the tales of loss, tragedy, and survival in the history of Texas are notable in both scope and intensity. But the many tales of brutality, conflict, and cruelty that line the annals of Texas history are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.